The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Not because the interstellar accord of sovereign species had any particular reverence for human calendars, they didn't even know what a Tuesday was, but because the laws of physics don't negotiate with scheduling preferences, and the relay beacon humanity had anchored at the edge of the Kuiper belt simply received the transmission when it arrived. It was 11:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. A junior signals analyst named Priya Rinkaran was halfway through a cup of bad coffee when her console lit up in a way she had been trained to recognize but had never actually seen. She set the coffee down very carefully. Then she called her supervisor. Within 40 minutes, the United Earth Defense Coordination, the UEDC, a body most civilians knew existed but quietly hoped would never have a reason to justify its budget, had been formally convened via secure uplink across 17 time zones. The message itself was not long. Translated through the linguistic bridge humanity had spent 19 years constructing after the first, far friendlier contact with a Velhari trading vessel in 2041, it read approximately as follows. To the biological collective designated Earth Sol 3, the Accord of Sovereign Species hereby notifies the aforementioned collective that its continued expansion of communication infrastructure into the Orion Transit Corridor constitutes a violation of the Spatial Sovereignty Compact, ratified by 31 member species in the year corresponding to your calendar designation of 1987. You were not signatories. You were not informed. This is not an oversight. The Accord does not seek signatories from pre-contact civilizations. However, your actions have now created an untenable precedent. You are given 40 of your planetary rotations to dismantle the relay network you call the Deep Reach Array. Failure to comply will be interpreted as a declaration of hostility, and the Accord will respond accordingly. There was a postscript. We do not expect compliance. We have never received compliance from a species at your developmental stage. But the compact requires the offer. Secretary General Amara Diallo read the message 3 times. The third time she read the postscript again and sat with it for a long moment. They've done this before, she said. Admiral Chen Weilin, commander of UEDC Strategic Command, nodded from the screen to her left. He was in a command facility somewhere under the Swiss Alps, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours. Their phrasing suggests a procedural routine. They send the notice. The species either can't dismantle or won't. Then they act. Then they move on. How many times? We don't know. The Velhari have trading routes through 4 regions where entire civilizations have simply gone quiet. We always assumed natural causes. Resource collapse, internal conflict. Diallo let that settle. The Deep Reach Array was not, as the Accord seemed to believe, an act of territorial aggression. It was a scientific project. 14 relay nodes positioned between 50 and 90 astronomical units from Earth's sun, designed to extend real-time communication with humanity's growing network of deep space research platforms. It had taken 11 years and the combined industrial output of 4 major space agencies to build. It employed, directly or indirectly, over 200,000 people. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. It was also, apparently, parked in a corridor that 31 alien civilizations had quietly carved out for themselves 60 years ago, without telling anyone else. Can we dismantle it? Asked Deputy Director Osei Frempong of the Scientific Infrastructure Council. Physically, said Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the array's lead architect, who had been pulled into the call from a research station on Titan. She looked briefly offended by the question. Yes, it would take about 3 years minimum. The outer nodes require crewed service vessels. We'd need to. They gave us 40 days, Frempong said. Silence. Tanaka blinked. That's not possible. No, Admiral Chin said. It isn't. There it was. The shape of the trap if it was a trap, or the shape of the impossible choice if it wasn't. 40 days to do what their own people said would take 3 years. And a postscript that said, we don't expect compliance. Which meant the timeline wasn't meant to be met. Which meant this had never been an ultimatum. It had always been a countdown. Diallo looked at the faces on her screen. Scientists, generals, diplomats, infrastructure engineers. Politicians who had spent their careers managing Earth's internal fractures and who now sat very still, recalibrating everything they thought they understood about humanity's place in the universe. All right, she said. We have 40 days. We are not going to spend them panicking. She looked at Admiral Chin. I need a realistic assessment of what we're facing. Not worst case. Not best case. Realistic. I've already started, he said. And I need the Velhari contacted. Quietly. If anyone in the Accord is going to talk to us as something other than an obstacle, it's them. That's a diplomatic long shot, said Foreign Affairs Director Neka Obi. Everything right now is a long shot, Diallo said. That doesn't mean we don't take them. She looked around the assembled faces one more time. And I want absolute information discipline. Nothing leaves this room that I haven't personally cleared. The last thing we need is 40 days of public panic when what we actually need is 40 days of work. The meeting adjourned. Priya Rinkaran, the signals analyst who had received the message, was asked to sign 3 separate non-disclosure agreements and was quietly reassigned to a UEDC support team. She didn't mind. The work felt important. She did, however, pour out the cold coffee and make a fresh cup. It seemed like the kind of situation that called for one. What no one said aloud in that meeting, what everyone thought but no one gave voice to because the room was full of professionals who understood that naming a fear is not the same as managing it, was the obvious question. 31 species. Civilizations old enough to have drafted a compact in 1987, when humanity was still figuring out whether the internet was a good idea. Species that had, according to the most reasonable interpretation of the evidence, done this before. Sent the notice. Waited for the countdown. Moved on. We do not expect compliance. They had never received compliance because no species at humanity's developmental stage had ever managed it. The physics were too hard. The timeline was too short. But none of those species had ever been human either. That wasn't arrogance. That was just a fact. And in the 40 days that followed, it would matter more than anyone in that room could have yet imagined. Admiral Chin Weilin had a habit, when facing a problem of unusual size, of writing it down by hand. Not because he distrusted computers. He had spent 30 years working with systems that could model the trajectory of a comet to within 3 meters at a distance of 8 billion kilometers. He trusted computers enormously. But there was something about the physical act of writing, pen against paper, the slight resistance, the permanence, that forced him to slow his thinking down to the speed of his hand. He was on his 3rd sheet of paper when his chief intelligence officer, Brigadier Lina Vasquez, knocked and entered without waiting. She had a tablet under one arm and the expression of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have. "Sit down," Chin said without looking up. "You'll want to look at this standing," she said. He looked up. The tablet showed a composite image assembled from 47 separate deep space observation platforms over the preceding 6 months. The UEDC's intelligence analysts had been quietly correlating anomalous gravitational readings in the outer system, readings that individually looked like noise, instrument drift, solar wind distortions, the kind of data that gets flagged, filed, and forgotten. Together they told a different story. "How long?" Chin asked. "Best estimate? They've had assets positioned in the outer system for at least 8 months. Before the message. Possibly longer, we lose resolution past the heliopause." Vasquez set the tablet on his desk. The Accord didn't send an ultimatum and then start mobilizing. They mobilized first. The message was the last step. Chin was quiet for a moment. "How many?" "We can't get a firm count. Gravitational shadow analysis suggests, and I want to stress that this is analysis, not confirmed observation, somewhere between 60 and 120 discrete mass signatures, ranging from what might be patrol-scale vessels to something significantly larger." "How significantly?" "The 3 largest signatures we've identified are each roughly analogous to a small moon in terms of gravitational displacement." She paused. "We think they might be mobile stations. Command infrastructure, maybe? We don't know." Chin set down his pen. The numbers were not what troubled him most. Numbers could be modeled. Numbers could be responded to. What troubled him was the implication of the timeline, 8 months of prepositioning followed by a 40-day countdown designed to be impossible to meet. That wasn't the behavior of a civilization responding to a provocation. That was the behavior of a civilization executing a plan it had already decided on. The Deep Reach Array hadn't caused this. It had been the pretext. "Who else has this?" he asked. "Me, you, and 3 analysts who've been moved to a secured facility and won't be going home for a while." "Keep it that way for now." He picked up his pen again. "Get me everything the Velhari have ever shared about Accord military doctrine. I know it's limited. I don't care. I want to understand how they think." "Already pulling it?" "But Chin," Vasquez hesitated. It was unusual enough that he noticed. "The Velhari contact. Diallo's quiet channel. I think we need to be careful about what we ask them for and what we imply we know." "Because?" "Because if the Accord has assets in our outer system and the Velhari are Accord members, then either they don't know, which tells us something about Accord internal politics, or they do know and they've been trading with us for 5 years anyway, which tells us something else." Chin thought about that. You think they might be playing both sides? I think the Velhari are merchants first. They've been merchants for longer than our species has had written language. I don't think we should assume they're enemies. I also don't think we should assume they're friends. Useful then. Potentially very useful. If we're careful. He nodded. What about our own assets? Current positioning? Vasquez pulled up a second display. Earth's active defense infrastructure was, by any honest accounting, modest relative to what the gravitational readings suggested it was facing. The UEDC maintained a permanent fleet, the first through third response groups, totaling 61 warships of varying class, most of them designed around the threat models of 2040, rogue state actors, near-Earth asteroid interdiction, the theoretical but not yet encountered problem of hostile first contact. The fleet was not nothing. Earth had been quietly, steadily militarizing its space presence since the first Velhari contact confirmed that the universe was not, in fact, empty. Humanity was not naive. But 61 ships, even well-crewed and well-armed, against an accord force of potentially 120 vessels backed by mobile stations the size of small moons. The math was uncomfortable. We also have the civilian infrastructure, Vasquez said, reading his expression. The Deep Reach Array itself is a network of relay nodes, but the platforms anchored to them are substantial structures. Some of them were built for long-duration crewed operations. They have onboard power, maneuvering capability. They're not warships. No. But they're also not nothing. And the people operating them are used to working in conditions that would ground most military crews. The deep space research community is. She considered her words. Adaptable. Chin looked at his sheet of paper. He had written in his careful hand, what do we actually have? What do they actually want? What happens if we're wrong about either? He underlined the last question. The Secretary General wants a realistic assessment, he said. Here's what I know to be true. We cannot meet the dismantlement timeline, that's a physical impossibility. We cannot fight a fleet of that scale conventionally, that's a strategic reality. What we can do is complicate their assumptions. He looked at Vasquez. Every plan of this kind depends on the target behaving predictably. They said it themselves. They've never received compliance from a species at our developmental stage. That means every engagement model they've built is based on what a civilization at our level typically does. Which is what? Panic? Fragment politically? Maybe attempt a last-minute negotiation that goes nowhere. Maybe launch a symbolic military response that gets overwhelmed in the first engagement. He tapped the paper. They've planned for all of that. What they haven't planned for, what they can't have planned for, is the alternative. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. Which is? A civilization that reads the situation clearly, accepts the reality of its position, and decides to be as expensive as possible to remove. He picked up his pen again. We don't have to win. We have to make winning cost more than it's worth. It was not, he was aware, a comforting strategic vision. It would not play well in a press release. It was not the kind of thing that inspired rallying speeches. But it was honest. And in his experience, honest assessments were the only ones worth building plans on. Outside, somewhere above the Swiss Alps, the sky was very clear, and the stars were very bright, and among them, invisible to any civilian telescope, something old and vast and certain of itself was moving slowly inward. Ambassador Kenji Mori had spent 5 years learning how to talk to the Velhari. Not just linguistically, though that had taken 3 years by itself, and he still occasionally made errors that his Velhari counterpart, a being called Sethavan, politely corrected with the alien equivalent of a patient sigh. What Mori had learned, more importantly, was how the Velhari structured meaning. How they weighted honesty differently than humans did. How a direct question in their framework was a social aggression, while an indirect one was a sign of respect and intelligence. He kept all of that in mind as he composed the message. The secure channel between the UEDC and the Velhari trade mission, headquartered, peculiarly, on a retrofitted platform in the asteroid belt that the Velhari had purchased legally and at considerable expense, had never been used for anything more sensitive than export negotiations and the occasional scientific data exchange. He was about to change that. The message, in its final form, was 600 words. It took Mori 4 hours to write it. Most of that time was spent not on what to say, but on what to leave unsaid, because the Velhari placed enormous value on what a speaker chose not to articulate. Silence, in their framework, was not absence of meaning. It was meaning in its purest form. He told Sethavan that humanity had received a communication from the Accord. He did not say ultimatum. He described humanity's situation as a navigational uncertainty, a phrase the Velhari used for situations where multiple paths existed but the terrain of each was unclear. He expressed a desire for collaborative cartography, another Velhari concept, meaning the shared construction of understanding between parties who have something to offer each other. He did not ask for help. To ask for help was, in Velhari culture, to declare bankruptcy, to admit that one had nothing of value to offer in exchange. Instead, he described what humanity had: the Deep Reach Array's complete scientific dataset, 11 years of observation from the outer solar system, including data on phenomena that Velhari instruments had never been positioned to capture. He described this as a gift in the direction of friendship, which in Velhari commercial language meant, I have something you want. I'm offering it before you ask. This creates an obligation. Then he sent it and waited. The response came 14 hours later. 14 hours was, by Velhari standards, extremely fast. Almost urgent. Sethavan's message was even more carefully constructed than Maury's. He read it 5 times with a translation specialist before he was confident he understood it. The Velhari knew about the Accord fleet. Of course they did, they were Accord members after all. What they told Maury, in the elegant indirection of their language, was that the decision to mobilize had not been unanimous. That within the 31-member Accord there were factions. That the group responsible for the ultimatum, which Sethavan's message delicately referred to as the impatient branch, had been gaining influence for the past 2 decades, largely on the strength of a doctrine that the Velhari's own records called, approximately, preemptive spatial inheritance. In blunt terms, the systematic removal of pre-compact civilizations before they could grow powerful enough to contest Accord territorial claims. The Velhari did not support this doctrine. They had voted against it twice. They had been overruled. Maury sat with that for a long time. They're telling us they're not our enemies, said Dr. Hannah Park, his translation specialist, carefully. They're telling us more than that, Maury said. They're telling us they're embarrassed. That this isn't the Accord they signed up for. He looked at the message again. There's a word here, Sevalin. I've seen it before but never in this context. What's the commercial translation? Park checked her reference. Literally, it means something like a ledger that has been falsified. In commercial context, it refers to a business arrangement where one party has been misled about the terms. She looked up. He's saying the Accord Compact was sold to them as something different from what it became. And now they're watching it be used against us. Against a civilization that gave them honest data before asking for anything in return, Park said quietly. Maury nodded slowly. Send the data. All of it. The complete Deep Reach dataset, unredacted. He paused. And ask him, indirectly of course, whether there are others within the Accord who share his perspective on the impatient branch. The response to that question took 3 days. When it came, it was brief. There are 7 member species who have registered formal dissent with the current action. They cannot stop it, but they are watching. And records are kept. 7 out of 31. Not enough to halt the fleet, but enough to suggest that the Accord was not monolithic. That the 31 signatures on the Spatial Sovereignty Compact did not represent 31 identical strategic interests. Fractures. Not large ones, but fractures. Meanwhile, on Earth, the political situation was deteriorating in the specific way that Diallo had feared. Information leaks. They had lasted 22 days before a transmission intercept was triangulated by 3 independent amateur radio astronomers in different countries, and the inference engine of international journalism had done the rest. By day 23, the general outline, alien ultimatum, impossible deadline, possible fleet in outer system, was public. The panic was not total. Humanity had, in the 2 decades since the Velhari contact, made something of a cultural peace with the idea that it was not alone. People had had time to adjust their cosmology. But there was a significant difference between we are not alone and there is a fleet in the outer solar system and we have 17 days left on a countdown. The protests were loud in some cities and very quiet in others, and the quiet ones worried Diallo more. In the quiet cities, people were not panicking. They were waiting to see what their governments would do. That, she thought, was either a profound expression of trust, or a profound expression of exhaustion, and she was not entirely sure which was more weight to carry. She had 17 days. She used the next one entirely on a call with the UEDC's Defense Engineering Division, a group of people who had been working without sleep for 3 weeks and who presented her, at the end of 8 hours, with a proposal they called, with the specific dry humor of people who have been awake too long, option uncomfortable. It was not a plan to win. It was a plan to matter. She approved it that evening with 2 conditions and 1 addition that the engineering team hadn't thought of, and that one addition would, 6 months later, be the detail that changed everything. But that is getting ahead of the story. The engineering team called it option uncomfortable because every comfortable option had already been crossed off the list. The comfortable options were: comply with the dismantlement order, physically impossible in the given time frame; negotiate a timeline extension. The Accord's message had included no negotiation mechanism, and inquiries through the Velhari channel had confirmed that the impatient branch was not interested in extensions, or mount a conventional military defense. 61 ships against an estimated 60 to 120, backed by structures with the mass of small moons. The math, as Admiral Chin had put it, was uncomfortable. What remained was something that had no clean strategic precedent, because the situation itself had no clean precedent. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, chief of the UEDC's Defense Infrastructure Engineering Division, presented option uncomfortable to Secretary General Diallo in a room with no recording equipment and 4 other people: Admiral Chin Vasquez, Deputy Director Frempong, and a quiet civilian named Marcus Webb, who was introduced only as a specialist in applied systems disruption and who had, by the look of him, been living on coffee and problem-solving for the better part of a month. The Deep Reach Array was never designed as a defensive asset, Al-Rashid began. But it is, at its core, a network. 14 nodes, each with onboard power generation, maneuvering capability, and, because we built them for 11-year operational lifespans in harsh environments, significant structural integrity. She pulled up a schematic. Each node masses approximately 600,000 metric tons. They were designed to hold position against solar wind pressure and minor gravitational perturbations. They can be repositioned. Repositioned how? Frempong asked. Slowly. And not anywhere we want. But the outer 4 nodes are within reasonable thrust range of several gravitationally significant positions in the Kuiper belt. She highlighted the positions. If we move them here, here, and here, over the next 12 days, which is possible if we start immediately, they occupy a region that any inbound fleet would have to either navigate around or through. They're relay nodes, Chin said carefully. Not weapons. Correct. But a 600,000 metric ton object in an unexpected position, broadcasting active signals across a full electromagnetic spectrum, is also a navigation hazard. A sensor-saturating navigation hazard. Al-Rashid paused. It doesn't stop a fleet. It doesn't damage a fleet. What it does is force a fleet to slow down and recalculate. And while they're doing that, we buy time, Diallo said. We buy time. And we do something else. Al-Rashid nodded to Marcus Webb. Webb stood, and the impression he gave was of someone who had spent a career thinking about problems that polite institutions preferred not to name directly. The Accord fleet, based on what our gravitational analysis shows, is moving on a vector consistent with a standard suppression approach, he said. We've modeled similar doctrines in human military history. The approach is efficient. It's designed for a target that either panics and disperses, or consolidates and presents a conventional engagement. They've done this before, Chin said. They've done this before against species at our developmental stage. Which means their engagement models are calibrated to a certain level of technological and organizational sophistication. Webb pulled up a secondary display, not military assets but civilian infrastructure. The global satellite network. The deep space research platform grid. The Velhari trade corridor. The asteroid mining operations in the belt. We have a lot of things in space that aren't weapons. Diallo understood immediately. You want to use the civilian infrastructure. Not as weapons. As presence. Webb's tone was careful, precise. A suppression doctrine works by establishing overwhelming local superiority and then projecting it inward. But that calculation depends on knowing where the target's assets are and what they're capable of. If, instead of consolidating our military assets in a defensive line, we distribute everything, research platforms, mining rigs, communication relays, the UEDC fleet itself, spread across a volume of space roughly equivalent to the inner solar system, the engagement model breaks down. Because they can't suppress what they can't localize, Vasquez said. And because every asset they have to individually account for is a decision they have to make, a calculation they have to run, a commander who has to issue an order. Webb looked at Diallo. They're expecting a target. We give them a landscape. Silence. It was a large idea and it had large problems. A distributed defense was, in conventional military terms, no defense at all. You couldn't concentrate force, couldn't mass firepower, couldn't hold a line. But it could, if executed correctly, transform a simple equation into a complicated one. And complicated equations cost time. Time, in this scenario, was the only currency that mattered. The civilian platforms, Frimpong said slowly. The people on them would need to be informed and given the choice, Diallo said flatly. All of them. This is not a conscription. Anyone who wants extraction back to Earth gets it. Extraction in 12 days, Al-Rashid said. For 217 platforms, approximately 19,000 personnel. Then we start now, Diallo said. The extraction operation began within 6 hours. Ships that had been quietly staging under the guise of routine resupply were redirected. Civilian platform crews across the outer solar system received for the first time a complete briefing, the message, the fleet, the timeline, and the choice. Of the 19,000 personnel contacted, 11,412 elected to remain at their posts. The UEDC had not expected that number. The psych modeling had predicted between 30 and 40% retention, optimistically. The actual figure was just over 60%. When Admiral Chin received the retention report, he read it twice. Then he sent a single-line message to Al-Rashid and Webb. Adjust the distribution model. We have more pieces than we thought. What he did not say, what he didn't need to say because they were all thinking it, was the obvious follow-up question. 11,000 civilians spread across the outer solar system, embedded in platforms and relay stations and mining rigs and research bases, operating equipment they had built and maintained and understood better than any military engineer. Why had so many of them stayed? The surveys would come later and they would reveal a range of motivations. Belief in the mission, unwillingness to abandon colleagues, a straightforward calculation that retreating to Earth didn't actually mean safety and, most commonly appearing in 63% of responses, a simple, quiet, entirely unremarkable sense that this was their work, their infrastructure, their piece of space, and they had not finished what they'd started. No one had told them to feel that way. No one had needed to. Day 40 arrived without ceremony. At 6 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, the UEDC's Deep Space Monitoring Network confirmed what its models had been predicting for 72 hours. The Accord fleet had crossed the heliopause. It was inside the solar system. Priya Rinkaran, who had by now been embedded in the UEDC's Signals Analysis Unit for over a month, watched the confirmation come in on her screen and felt something she would later describe as the floor tilting. Not panic. Not the sharp adrenaline shock she had expected. Just a slow, vertiginous sensation, like the world rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. She noted the timestamp and flagged the event for immediate escalation. Then she went back to work. The fleet, as it resolved from gravitational shadow into something more concrete, was larger than the most conservative estimates and smaller than the worst-case ones. UEDC analysts counted 89 discrete mass signatures, including the 3 large stations that Chen's team had identified weeks earlier. The stations were now clearly visible to purpose-built instruments. Vast structures, roughly cylindrical, each several kilometers in length, moving at a velocity that suggested they had been built for endurance rather than speed. They were not in a hurry. They had done this before. The Accord fleet did not broadcast a message when it crossed the heliopause. This, the Velhari analysis had predicted. The impatient branch did not communicate with targets during an engagement. Communication implied negotiation, and negotiation implied the target had standing. The crossing of the heliopause was itself the statement. Admiral Chen was at his command station in the Swiss facility, surrounded by screens and people and the particular quality of silence that descends on a room full of professionals confronting the thing they have been preparing for. He did not make a speech. He had written one because his communications officer had asked him to, and he had read it over twice and decided it was unnecessary. The people in his command had been at their stations for a month. They knew what was happening and they knew what to do. He gave 3 orders in the first hour. The first was to activate the repositioned deep reach nodes. The 4 outer nodes, moved over the preceding 12 days into their new positions in the Kuiper belt, powered up their full electromagnetic broadcast suites. Not targeting arrays, not weapons, just the same signals they had always broadcast, but louder, wider, saturating a band of space roughly 40 million kilometers across with active sensor noise. For any fleet attempting precision navigation through that region, it was the equivalent of trying to read a map in a thunderstorm. The second order was to disperse. The 61 ships of the UEDC response groups, rather than consolidating into a defensive formation, scattered across a volume of space following the distribution model Webb had designed. Each ship was assigned a civilian platform within communications range, not to defend it but to coordinate with it, to become part of the same distributed network. The third order was the one that Chen had added at the last minute, the one that wasn't in the original option uncomfortable brief, the one that Diallo had approved with a single nod when he'd proposed it at 2 a.m. 3 days earlier. He activated the archive broadcast. The archive broadcast was, in its conception, straightforward. A continuous transmission on multiple frequencies, directed outward toward the Accord fleet and beyond, containing the complete public record of humanity's first contact history. The Velhari negotiations. The Deep Reach Array project files. The scientific data. The diplomatic correspondence. The dissenting votes of the 7 Accord member species that Sethavan had told Maury about. Everything that documented what had actually happened, as opposed to the Accord's framing of it as a territorial violation. It was not a weapon. Was a record. But records, in a community of civilizations, have weight. They'll ignore it, Vasquez told Chin when he first proposed it. The impatient branch will ignore it, he said. The 7 who dissented won't. And there may be others we don't know about. He looked at her. We are not just fighting an engagement. We are fighting a narrative. Every civilization in the Accord that sees this broadcast has to make a decision about what they're participating in. On day 40 hour 6, the Accord fleet made its first significant move. 4 vessels, patrol class based on their mass signatures, separated from the main body and accelerated toward the inner system on a vector that would take them past the Deep Reach node's new positions. They were not moving toward Earth. They were moving toward the nodes. Chin watched the vector analysis and understood immediately. The nodes were the stated reason for the ultimatum. Destroying them was the first act, symbolic, establishing the validity of the original claim, demonstrating that the compact would be enforced. A clean, legible first move. Except the nodes were no longer sitting at predictable coordinates. The 4 patrol vessels slowed. Recalculated. The electromagnetic saturation from the broadcast suite was, based on UEDC signals analysis, actively interfering with their navigation resolution. They were not blind, but they were not reading cleanly either. They slowed further. This was, in the context of the larger engagement, a small thing. For patrol ships slowing down. But the Accord fleet had been designed around the assumption of predictable targets, and the nodes were not where they were supposed to be, and the signals environment was not what the fleet's models had accounted for. Every plan survives contact with reality until it doesn't. On Earth, people were watching. The UEDC had made a deliberate choice to release a curated real-time feed, not raw data which would have been incomprehensible, but a translated summary, updated every 30 minutes, that told the global population what was happening in plain language. It was Diallo's decision, made over the objection of 2 senior communications advisors who argued that transparency during a military engagement was a liability. The alternative is silence, she had said, and silence breeds rumors that are always worse than reality. Our people deserve to know what we're doing and why. If we can't justify our decisions to the people on whose behalf we're making them, then we should reconsider the decisions. The feed was watched by approximately 4 billion people. The most watched moment, later compiled into a 30-second clip that circulated globally for years, was not a battle. It was Priya Rinkaran, caught by an internal camera in the signals room, watching the feed from the 4 patrol vessels slow down, and very quietly saying to the analyst next to her, "They expected us to be exactly where we were supposed to be." Her colleague said, "Yeah. And we weren't," she said. She was smiling when she said it. Not triumphantly. Just the smile of someone watching a complicated problem yield, very slightly, to a well-considered solution. The day was not over. The fleet was still there. The math was still hard. But the floor had tilted back. The archive broadcast reached the Accord fleet on day 40 hour 8. It reached the 7 dissenting member species approximately 12 hours before that, because Maury, on Diallo's instruction, had transmitted it directly to Sethavan's platform in the asteroid belt before it was directed outward. The Velhari received it, acknowledged receipt, and said nothing for 6 hours. When Sethavan finally responded, it was in the most direct language Maury had ever received from him. A measure, in Velhari terms, of either great urgency or great emotion, possibly both. The message said, "You have done something that has not been done before. You have made the record available before the record was needed. This is not the behavior of a civilization expecting to lose." Maury read it twice. Then he wrote back carefully, "We are not certain of any outcome. We are certain of what happened, and we believe that certainty has value regardless of outcome." Sethavan's reply came in 40 minutes. "I have shared the archive with the 6 other dissenting species. There is a discussion occurring. I cannot tell you its conclusion. But I can tell you that the word being used in several of our languages translates approximately as accountability. Accountability. In the Accord's 31 species political architecture, accountability was not a soft concept. The Accord operated under a system of collective record. Every significant action by member species was logged, attributed, and preserved in a shared archive that could be referenced in future compact negotiations. It was, in effect, a civilizational credit system. Actions that violated the compact's stated principles accumulated debt. Enough debt over time meant reduced standing, reduced voting weight, reduced access to Accord trade routes. The impatient branch had operated under the assumption that the elimination of a pre-compact civilization was too small an event to generate significant record debt. Previous actions of this kind had generated minimal political consequence, because the eliminated civilizations had not produced coherent external documentation of what had happened to them. Humanity had produced documentation. Extensively. In 11 formats, broadcast on 47 frequencies, directed at every known reception point within range. The 7 dissenting species had, according to Sethavan's subsequent messages over the following 20 hours, formally submitted a request for emergency compact review, a procedural mechanism that, under Accord law, required the halt of any active enforcement action pending a full council review. The impatient branch rejected the request. This was, Sethavan noted carefully, itself a violation. They're creating a paper trail against themselves, Vasquez said, when Maury's reports reached the Swiss facility. They think it doesn't matter, Chin said. They think they'll be done with this before the review process has any teeth. Will they be right? Chin looked at the tactical display. The Accord fleet had, over the preceding 18 hours, resumed its advance after the navigational disruption caused by the repositioned nodes. The 4 patrol vessels had eventually found 2 of the nodes and were clearly maneuvering to disable them, carefully without destroying them, which was interesting. Destruction would have been faster. The care suggested they were operating under rules of engagement that required proportional response, at least for now. The main fleet body was still 40 hours from meaningful engagement range with any UEDC assets. What they'll be right about, Chin said, is that the review process won't stop the fleet in time. What they may be wrong about is whether it stops them afterward. He turned to his communications officer. Get me a direct channel to the Perseverance. The Perseverance was the UEDC's oldest and largest vessel. A ship that had been, in a previous life, a deep space habitat module before being refitted for defense operations, and that still retained, in its bones, the engineering philosophy of something designed to keep humans alive in hostile environments for years at a time. It was currently positioned near Ceres, in the asteroid belt, coordinating with the civilian mining infrastructure in the region. Its captain, Commander Yara Okonkwo, came on screen looking as though she had slept 4 hours in the last 2 days and found this entirely acceptable. Status, Chin said. The belt network is as coordinated as it's going to get, she said. 14 mining platforms, 6 research stations, 2 Velhari trade vessels that elected to stay. That last part surprised me, but I'm not complaining. She paused. The Velhari captains say they're here as observers. Neutral witnesses. Their words. Witnesses, Chin repeated. That's what they said. They've been broadcasting continuously on Accord standard frequencies since they anchored. I don't know what they're broadcasting. My translation team is working on it. The translation team's report came back 4 hours later. The 2 Velhari vessels were broadcasting a continuous feed of the archive broadcast, repackaged in Accord standard format, on a frequency used for Accord internal communications. They were, in effect, ensuring that the record of what was happening reached every Accord vessel in the fleet, not just the 7 dissenting species. This was not neutral. This was, by any reasonable interpretation, a Velhari choice. Sethavan, when asked directly, said only, merchants keep records. It is how we ensure the integrity of future transactions. Maury read the message and laughed, quietly, alone in his office, the first genuine laugh he had managed in 30 days. Then he wrote, please convey to the Velhari captains that their presence is noted and appreciated. Sethavan's response, they know. They are watching your distributed network with considerable professional interest. Several of them have asked questions about the engineering of the outer platform nodes that suggest they are evaluating a commercial proposition. I mention this only because I believe it indicates a level of confidence in your situation's resolution that I find meaningful. The Velhari captains thought there would be future trade. That was, in its way, the most optimistic intelligence report the UEDC had received in 40 days. On Earth, Diallo received the Sethavan communications summary at midnight, local time, and sat with it for a long time in a quiet office that smelled like old paper and the particular stillness of a building that had been working at full capacity for a month. She was tired in the way that goes past the body and into something harder to name, the tiredness of sustained uncertainty, of making decisions in incomplete information, of holding a very large thing steady with insufficient hands. She thought about the Accord Council chambers. The 7 voices that had said no twice and been overruled. 7 out of 31. But they had spoken. And the Velhari had stayed. And the record existed. And in the solar system, 40 hours from whatever came next, 11,000 people were at their stations in the dark, doing their work. She turned off the light in her office and went to find a few hours of sleep. Tomorrow, she thought, would be the day that determined what kind of tomorrow came after. The engagement, when it came, lasted 11 days. Later, military historians, human and, eventually, others, would spend considerable effort debating whether engagement was even the correct word for what occurred. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. There was no single decisive confrontation, no line held or broken, no moment where the outcome hung on a single action. What it was, more precisely, was a grinding, distributed, exhausting contest of attrition, not of ships or lives, though both were spent, but of assumptions. The Accord Fleet's operational doctrine, as UEDC analysts had theorized and the engagement confirmed, was built around 3 phases: approach, isolation, and conclusion. In the approach phase, the fleet established navigational dominance of the target system, positioning assets to prevent the target from retreating or receiving external support. In the isolation phase, critical infrastructure was disabled, communication networks, power generation, anything that organized resistance. In the conclusion phase, the target either surrendered, fragmented, or was suppressed. The approach phase had been complicated by the repositioned deep reach nodes and the electromagnetic saturation they created. The patrol vessels eventually disabled 2 of the 4 nodes, at a cost of significant navigation time, and 1 patrol ship that suffered a collision with an uncharted Kuiper Belt object while operating in degraded sensor conditions. Not a combat casualty, but a loss nonetheless, and one that the archive broadcast noted with precise, dispassionate detail. The isolation phase never completed. The distribution model Webb had designed proved, in practice, more effective than the models had predicted, for a reason that the models had not fully accounted for: human improvisation. The UEDC 61 ships were not simply dispersed across the solar system. They were integrated with the civilian infrastructure they were coordinating with. Miners who had spent years operating in the belt knew its terrain with an intimacy no tactical database could replicate. Research platform crews adapted their equipment in ways their original designers had not anticipated. The Perseverance, coordinating from Ceres, served as a relay hub for a communications network that the Accord fleet spent 4 days trying to localize and shut down before the fleet signals analysts apparently concluded it was not a military network at all, but something more organic and, for that reason, harder to systematically address. The Velhari vessels broadcast throughout. On day 7 of the engagement, something happened that Chin had hoped for but had not built his planning around, because hoping and planning are different disciplines and a good strategist doesn't confuse them. The Emergency Compact Review, filed by the 7 dissenting species 18 days earlier, reached quorum. Under Accord procedural law, a quorum review could not halt an active engagement. That authority rested with the fleet commander. But it could formally classify the engagement as contested, which meant every action taken from that point forward was subject to individual attribution and record. Every commander who issued an order. Every species whose fleet assets participated. Every decision logged under a name. The impatient branch had, until this point, operated under the collective shield of Accord authority. We acted on behalf of the compact, not as individuals. The quorum ruling stripped that shield. Fleet Commander Vareth 7, the designation the UEDC's translation team had assigned to the individual commanding the Accord force, halted the advance for 9 hours following the quorum notification. 9 hours of stillness. Chin watched the tactical display and said nothing. His staff watched him not saying anything and also said nothing. The signals room recorded and analyzed and the archive broadcast kept broadcasting and the 11,000 people at their posts in the dark kept doing their work. Then the fleet resumed its advance. But the vector had changed. Not toward Earth. Not toward the remaining deep reach nodes. Toward the 3 large command stations, which had been positioned at the outer edge of the fleet formation throughout the engagement. They were repositioning. Pulling back. Not retreating. Chin was careful not to use that word in his reports because the distinction mattered. A retreat is a tactical withdrawal in response to combat pressure. What the Accord fleet was doing was something more like a recalculation. The advance element was being recalled to the stations. The patrol vessels that had been ranging through the belt were contracting. On day 9, Sethavan sent a message to Mori that was, by Velhari standards, almost breathtakingly direct. Verith 7 has submitted a formal request to the Accord Council for clarification of engagement authority under the contested classification. This is unprecedented. In the 14 previous actions of this kind in Accord history, no fleet commander has requested clarification mid-engagement. The Council is meeting. Mori forwarded the message to Chen and Diallo simultaneously. Diallo read it at 3 a.m. and did not go back to sleep. Day 11. The Accord fleet had not advanced in 48 hours. The UEDC's distributed network was intact, reduced by the loss of the 2 deep reach nodes and 3 civilian platforms that had been disabled. Not destroyed, disabled, a distinction the archive broadcast noted, and 1 UEDC warship that had suffered drive damage in an encounter with a patrol vessel and been evacuated successfully. No human fatalities in direct engagement action. Several injuries. The miners and researchers who had stayed at their posts had not been touched. The Accord fleet had, apparently, declined to engage civilian infrastructure after the quorum ruling. On the morning of Day 11, a new signal arrived. Not from the fleet. From the Accord Council. It was addressed not to the UEDC but to the biological collective designated Earth Sol 3, which was technically the same address as the original ultimatum but felt different now. The message informed humanity that a formal review of the Spatial Sovereignty Compact application to pre-contact civilizations had been initiated. That the current enforcement action was suspended pending the review's completion. That humanity was invited to submit documentation relevant to the review to the Accord's public record archive. It did not apologize. The Accord did not, apparently, do apologies. But it was, in the reading of every diplomat and strategist who analyzed it, a retreat. Not from the solar system. The fleet was still there, still watching, still real, but from certainty. From the unquestioned assumption that pre-compact civilizations were obstacles to be cleared rather than parties to be considered. The review would take, Sethavan estimated, between 2 and 4 years. Its outcome was not guaranteed. The impatient branch still existed, still had influence, still believed what it believed. But 7 had become 9, and 9 had become 12, and the record was there, immutable and public for every species in the Accord to read. On Earth, when the suspension was announced, there were celebrations in some cities and very quiet relief in others. Diallo watched the feeds for a while and then turned them off. It was not victory. She was careful about that word too. It was a pause in a very long process, and the process would require more work and more clarity and more patience than any 40-day crisis could resolve. In the signals room, Priya Rinkaran received the suspension notification, logged it with precise timestamp, and sent the formatted report up the chain. Then she looked at the message for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Suspension pending review. She thought about the postscript of the original message. We do not expect compliance. They had been right. Humanity had not complied. Humanity had done something the Accord's models hadn't accounted for, and it wasn't a superweapon or a brilliant tactical stroke or an act of impossible heroism. It was documentation. Patience. Distribution. The decision to make 11,000 people's work visible. And 7 voices that had always said no, finally having a record worth pointing to. She logged off her station. Went to find something to eat. Outside it was morning and the sky was the same sky it had always been, and it was not simple and it was not safe and it was not over. But the floor was level. For now that was enough.